I'm just basically, I'm curious to understand, does the Bible have the status of what I would call historical facticity? Even if there is some historical truth to this, it's an interesting mythology which basically exceptionalizes the Jewish claim to Israel, in the sense that if you had to redraw the map based on people's claims from thousands of years past, we'd be, I mean, we already are in a right old mess, but there would be wars all over the world, people claiming various aspects of land.
Because when I see the word Zionism mentioned in the media, the mainstream media, or the newspapers, they are not defining it according to what I understand Zionism to be, and I do not believe that people other than Jews, this was a Jewish movement, can define what Zionism is. It's part of, it's a great Jewish movement, and it cannot be defined by other people. And I understand that the real wound, the real Nakba, here's my point, the real Nakba were these agreements. 1916, the Sykes-Picot.
But that doesn't make the charge against the contemporary Zionist project one of complicit.
But just starting with that point.
This is the first in a series of discussion and debate on Zionism, anti-Semitism, and the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. I am Russell Kaplan, Kaplan with a C, a lapsed or non-Zionist, some would argue an anti-Zionist, and joining me is my friend, Dr. Brian Kaplan, Kaplan with a K. We have no expertise on the subject matter, other than having both been brought up in a strong Zionist milieu and having read and followed the various experts in their writings, talks, and debates. While we have nothing particularly new to contribute to the raging debate and struggle between two seemingly intractable positions, we hope that the respectful manner of our debate demonstrates the possibility of finding some mutual ground in sharing our common humanity despite the strong differences. So I think it's probably appropriate, Brian, for you to begin to give an account of your understanding of Zionism.
Well, thank you, Russell. Part of my approach to this is for us to really define our terms. I'm sure you'll be happy to do that. Let us really try to understand what a word means, particularly a loaded word like Zionism. And we may even disagree on exactly what it means, but let me say what it means to me.
Sure.
The word Zion is originates in the biblical Hebrew by the ancient people of Judea, of which the word Jew comes from. And this word was used to describe a mountain in Jerusalem, and it was also then used to describe Jerusalem itself. That's where the word arose, Sion. Okay. Now, this word didn't come into being until a long time afterwards. So as we know, the word Zionism came into being a long time afterwards, because as we know, the Jews and the Judean people were expelled from Israel at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, creating what we now understand as the diaspora, the great dispersion of Jews all over the planet. Of course, that is a crucial moment because there was an ancient civilization living there in Judea, and Israel was slightly north of Judea. It was one kingdom, and the Israel part fell in about 786 BC, and then later on the Judea fell as well, 70 AD, and that caused the great dispersion. Okay, so ever since then, Jews obviously would have wanted to come back. That was their ancient homeland for about 1,500 years, something like that, leading up to 70 AD. That was where Jews were. That was the country. After 70 AD, they wandered all over the world, and nevertheless, some Jews did live in the area of Judea and Israel. They did live there. There were always some Jews there. However, in about the 7th century, there was a massive influx of Muslims and Arabs, which basically constituted a type of colonization. In other words, they moved in en masse into the area in the 7th century. And so therefore then the Jews become a much, much smaller minority of people in the area. So that's what happened then. But if we go from the 7th century all the way to 1948, when the State of Israel was declared, we are talking about a 1200 period where the area was basically under Muslim control, Arab control. That's what happened up all the way there. Okay, so that's a long period of time. So let's just be clear. Jews had from about 1500 years before 70 AD, and then from 7th century to the 19th century or the 20th century, that's another 1,200 years.
Okay, so I want to interject there. If I mean, obviously, I understand you going to develop this into a more contemporary idea of the Zionist project. But I think I just want to raise some criticism of that account, because in a sense, it constitutes a very important part of the Zionist mythology that Jews always inhabited this area in the sort of, and basing one's historical knowledge on biblical records, maybe on some archaeological records as well. But I observed that you referred to Jews being the original inhabitants of this geographical area, geographical space, and then were forced into exile.
70 AD.
In 17 AD. 70 AD, and that the Arab or Muslim people, you specifically used the word colonized. So in a sense, it's you kind of harking back to a biblical period and reversing the charge against contemporary Zionism as a settler colonial project.
We'll come back to that. But...
And referring to the Arab or Palestinian population as the as the
Colonizers.
what would be the colonizers, the
Well, a lot of them moved in.
settler colonialism. So I just wanted to flag that up now. So
and I'm not doing it for that purpose, but there was a lot of people that moved. There were a lot of people that moved in. Okay, that's for sure in the seventh century.
Right.
However, if you go from the 7th century, that's another 1,200 years to 1948. That's 1,200 years of those people being the majority in the land. So I can understand that's a long time, okay? So here we have it, 1,500 years of Jews and then 1,200 years more of Arabs and Muslims being the majority, okay? So that is what happened.
Can I just ask you another question there? What is the historical provenance or proof of Jews having inhabited this land in the way you describe?
Steles, which are memorials that with Hebrew letters on them, rocks with Hebrew letters, the description, the analysis of the Bible and the time that was probably written. There's a lot to say there.
The analysis in the Bible.
Well, there's no Bible. I mean, we're talking since do you mean before 70 AD? What recognition?
I'm just basically, I'm curious to understand, does the Bible have the status of what I would call historical facticity? Is it, have these things actually been verified according to contemporary scientific practice?
I would say so. There's enough there to suggest, and the writing and who wrote this stuff, I believe it was Jews living in Judea who wrote the Bible, but that's when it was written. Okay, and there's Hebrew that goes back a long time. Okay, so so that people did move in then. And then in the 19th century, there began a movement which began to be called Zionism. And it was a Jewish movement. And the early Zionists were people like Moses Hess, who was a colleague of Karl Marx. I'm sure that interests you. And there were others, Rabbi Kalish, just that began to make mutterings, a classic book actually, more than a muttering by Moses Hess, called Rome and Jerusalem, a classic text, of this idea that we need this homeland for Jews to return to. Not unreasonably, there'd been all sorts of anti-Semitic pogroms in Eastern Europe particularly. And this reached its apotheosis at the Dreyfus trial in Paris, where Dreyfus was wrongly convicted of spying, a Jewish military officer was wrongly convicted of spying against the French. And man in the audience there was a journalist and writer, Theodor Herzl, who then began the process of political Zionism. So let me just be clear that this is 1897, and what Zionism meant then was this: it was a good idea to have a movement that would encourage Jews to go and live in Israel, okay, in the area. That's where it is. That's the marked position. Remember I said Zion means a hill in Jerusalem, means Jerusalem, it means that area. So here was a movement that said we should go back, okay? Now, it was a political movement as far as Herzl was concerned, but then there would come other Zionists, and I'm sure you're familiar with them, would talk about it as being as a cultural movement. It was nevertheless a movement that said you should go back. Now, it is inconceivable that at that time that anyone would have thought a Zionist is someone that could live in London and say, I'm a Zionist, as I would now. That's inconceivable, okay? The Zionist, why are you living here? Why are you living here in London if you're a Zionist? Why you must go? That's your whole mission, is to go. And now that there is a chance to go, why don't you go? That would be the Zionism. This was the case until, this is the meaning of the word. Zionist would be one who got up and went to Israel if he could. Until the early 20th century, when a man called Louis Brandeis, famous for Brandeis University, famous for being a jurist on the Supreme Court, famous for being a trusted confidant of Woodrow Wilson, the President of America at the time, he brought this a slight new type of Zionist without actually defining it, where people could support Zionism in the diaspora, in the Great Dispersion. Jews could support Zionism without actually getting up and going. So you could raise money, or you could support the political process. And this, let's go right back to the meaning of this word Zionism. This is the only variation of the word Zionism. In other words, it's the only change. At one time, Zionism meant you pick up your bags and you go there. Now it became you could support financially, morally, spiritually, prayers, whatever it is, you could support it. That became the new Zionism. Or it included those people who didn't actually go. And I am so adamant that this needs to be discussed, because what I see the word Zionism mentioned in the media, the mainstream media, or the newspapers, they are not defining it according to what I understand Zionism to be. And I do not believe that people other than Jews, this was a Jewish movement, can define what Zionism is. It's part of, it's a great Jewish movement, and cannot be defined by other people.
Right. Okay. So I think I want to respond. You've raised quite a lot there. Okay. So the first thing, which links to the question I asked you about the historical facticity, the veracity of the biblical origins of Zionism.
Only the word Zion. There's no Zionism in.
Yeah, no, I understand, but I'm saying that a contemporary, you would agree that contemporary Zionism draws, in terms of its mythology, which we'll come to, draws on its biblical roots. Otherwise, why on earth would you choose this particular place called Israel, Palestine, other than London?
Yeah.
So if you're dealing with the religious aspect, and there are many religious Zionists now. In fact, I read recently a poll that indicates that the majority of Israeli citizens now are religious people. But even if there is some historical truth to this, it's an interesting mythology which basically exceptionalizes the Jewish claim to Israel, in the sense that if you had to redraw the map based on people's claims from thousands of years past, we'd be, I mean, we already are in a right old mess, but there would be wars all over the world, people claiming various aspects of land. I mean, the United Kingdom, these British Isles, would be contested by all sorts of people as well. So, I mean, that's the first problem. I would say that's a weakness in Zionism. Someone some time back said to me that it's rather peculiar that the Israel, which then and in a sense still remains rather secular, but it's the only secular country that invokes the Bible to justify its existence.
Let's be clear. Let's be clear about this, because I know what you're talking about. You're talking about people, theocratic Zionism, in the sense of saying what it says in the Bible, those are the borders of the land, etc. Now, what I'm going to say now is not going to make me popular with those sort of people. I don't agree with that. I agree that Zion was a hill in Jerusalem, and in the general area there was a desire to return, and we said it. Jews said it for at least 1,000 years. Shana Haba'a Berushalayim.
Sure.
Next year in Jerusalem. We're going back. But I'm not going to argue about where these borders. I agree, it shouldn't be done according to the Bible or any book. And because I think that the people who oppose that, they've also got a book that says things, and it's not going to be the same as what it says in our book. But there was a general idea, yes, we want to return to that land. And that land, I mean, if you look in 1936, what was offered, and the Peel Commission offered to Israel, what they offered as a state was very, very small, and it didn't have a lot of the areas which these new theocratic Zionists or religious right Zionists are claiming is based on the Bible. So, yeah, I'm not a theocrat. I can never support that.
I absolutely. I'm aware of that.
So let's look at what happened. Yeah, okay.
Sorry, just let me continue with. I'm particularly intrigued by the Louis Brandeis's notion of Zionism, which I think is hugely contradictory and hugely problematic. In other words, what he's saying, and let's in fact look at some of the more recent history of Jews and Zionism. The Second World War and the threat to European Jewry was met with a resistance by European countries and by North American countries to keep Jews out of those countries.
Correct.
And even the Zionist movement in those countries, the established Zionist movement, was reluctant to push back on that policy. They were, in a sense, only interested in Jews who wanted to emigrate to Israel, to which was then still, I think, called Palestine. And Brandeis represents one of those Jews who's part of the American establishment. And in a way, there's something I think quite cynical in saying, Zionists, you don't have to go to Israel. It's kind of saying, we Jews, we're established Jews wherever we live, and actually we don't want to go to Israel, and actually we prefer you Jews not to come where we are and upset our established existence. So it's better if you go to Israel. So I think that I thought you said that you gave an account of that in a way with a positive, looking at it positively, and I think that's it's not very positive at all. And so when you come to this question of Zionism and the Zionist project, there's a huge contradiction because Jews, and we'll still come to this a little further on in this discussion, Jews living in the diaspora, by and large, post-Second World War, are very comfortable. I mean, they might face some anti-Semitism, but it's very, very diminished in terms of its virulence, in terms of its existential
in the last
threat.
year, I would argue
to Jews.
that. I'd
Okay,
argue against that in the last year. But yes, I do accept what you're saying there about the political motivations of these people. But I simply wanted to make the point that the word changed so that people all over the world called themselves Zionists who supported the movement of Jews and living in Israel, even though they didn't go themselves. The word changed.
Yeah.
If we can agree on that.
No, that's absolutely important, given what this discussion is. I want to hear your account
narrative
of Zionism so that I can respond to it.
So let's stay with this narrative.
Okay.
So what happened is in the 19th century, as I said, in about 1897, the Dreyfus Affair, Theodor Herzl. Now, what happened was Herzl wanted to create a Jewish state, and he wrote a play called the Judenstaat. So he wanted to create a Jewish state. And so he did everything he could, and they had all these Zionist conferences. But he also asked the people who had control of that area permission to create a Jewish state. Now, the people in charge of that area were the Ottomans, right? The Ottoman Empire, and the head of the Ottoman Empire was the Sultan. And he got the message to the Sultan that he'd like to create a Jewish state there. And the answer was not in the affirmative. The answer was no, you can't do that. However, and this is the really, really key point that I want to get across in this first thing that happened to Zionism, is that the First World War, I think that one day the First World War and the Second World War, which were so close to each other, will just look like a conflagration in Europe. But in the First World War, in 1916, the Allies sort of knew they were going to win that war, particularly the French and the British. They sort of knew they were going to win that war. And so they started making plans for knowing that they would get control over this area. The Ottomans would go down, I guess, with the Austro-Hungarian empires would go down, the beginning of the end for the British Empire even. They sort of knew, we'll have control of this area. So at a secret meeting in 1916, a French diplomat by the name of Picot, P-I-C-O-T, and quite a more high-up diplomat by the name of Sykes, Mark Sykes, met in secret and basically decided, we are going to take this chunk of land here and part of it will be a Jewish state, and you the French, you'll have control over Lebanon and Syria, and we'll keep Egypt, and we'll have an influence on that, we'll have a mandate in Palestine, and we'll do in Palestine. And then, thanks Chaim Weizmann for helping us with acetone and various things, and actually we are sympathetic to a Jewish state there, so we'll create a Jewish state. We'll show intention for a Jewish state as well. And then in 1917, the Balfour Declaration showed that the government came out and said we are open they're open to create this Jewish state. This is exactly what happened. This is not propaganda. This is what happened. Now, I can understand that whole peninsula was Arabia. You see, and since the 7th century. So for 1,200 years, that was Arabia. It belonged to Arabs. It wouldn't have been called Palestine. In fact, an Arab living there would say that he would describe himself as an Arab or Muslim that lives here as part of Greater Syria or the area, but he wouldn't have said, I'm a Palestinian, okay? But they had been there. And I understand that the real wound, the real Nakba, here's my point, the real Nakba were these agreements. 1916, the Sykes-Picot. In fact, we wouldn't believe that the head of ISIS said something that I understood. When at the height of his powers in Mosul, the head of ISIS said, we shall not cease in this mission of ours until we have knocked the last nail into the coffin of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So he knew that was the insult to the area. The real insult to the area was a secret cooperation between the French and the British, that they would carve this area up, they would keep influence, the French, Lebanon, Syria, as I said, the British, definitely the Palestinian mandate, they were sympathetic to a Jewish state, and they did all this behind closed doors. It changed a bit, and then after 1923 or something like that, Churchill was involved in various things, they took a lot of the land, the British again, took a lot of the land that would have been part of the Palestinian state probably, and they called it Jordan, 78% of the land actually. So that reduced the amount of land that the Jews and Palestinians would have to share. Then of course came the Second World War, as you said, and the massive sympathy to Jews. The United Nations have a resolution where they vote that there should be a Jewish state. David Ben-Gurion declares a Jewish state. Israel immediately goes into civil war, and in that civil war, where in early 1948, where they lost land. Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's a good point for me to come in there. and I want to pick up on the Sykes-Picot or Picot-Sykes Act, which was the grand European, the grand imperialism of the various European imperial powers to break up break up the land according to the victors. Victor takes all. Now, in a way, the contemporary Israel I see a logical continuity in that. And let me explain. Theodor Herzl, considered the father of modern Zionism, and his followers always recognized that in order to get a Jewish state, they would have to find an imperial surrogate. So most colonies have a mother country. So in South Africa, it was the Dutch, then it was the British. In Latin America, it was the Spanish. And that's generally how colonialism developed. I mean, if we take the Antipodes, Australia and New Zealand, the imperial mother country was Great Britain, the preeminent imperial power during that period. And modern Zionism had to find an imperial surrogate as well. And these imperialist powers certainly felt an affinity. I'm not saying they loved Jews, but they felt an affinity for European Jews who could set up some kind of imperial base within that area of the world, which was strategic, which was rich in fossil fuels, raw materials, which with increasing industrialization, development of capitalism was needed. So the relationship was fairly symbiotic. Now we come to, you referred to the cultural Zionists, and I want to come to them because they are a part of Zionism which is much underplayed and neglected and probably forgotten.
I would say were part more than are. Okay.
Well, I was going to come to the were, because today they would probably be considered anti-Zionist in the way that I presented myself. Now, starting with Achad Ha'am and his followers in the great Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, Judah Magnus, Ernst Simon, and the Ichud and Brit Shalom movement. I mean, it's interesting that they are referred to as cultural Zionists, but their position was emphatically political. They were totally opposed to the establishment of an exclusive, ethnocentric Jewish state. They were, in fact, totally opposed to the UN partition plan. And they appeared before various UN commissions that came to Jerusalem to argue the case against partition. In fact, Ben-Gurion and the Zionists who were in control of the Yishuv, which
the settlement,
which was the Jewish settlement before they came up with the name of Israel. It was called Yishuv, Yishuv. Yeah. So these Buber, Magnus, Simon, Ehud, Brit Shalom, they were, of course, they were a minority. I'm not saying that they were the majority, but they argued very strongly against the establishment of a Jewish state, against the partition of Palestine, as precisely their argument was anti-imperialist. They said the Jews living in Israel should pin their colors to the growing anti-imperial mast which many Arab nationalists were involved in. And he said that is they said that is the future of Jewish presence in this land. We should work with our Arab brothers and sisters in establishing one single state that promised equality for all. Unfortunately, I mean, this comes back with the Holocaust. In a way, the Jewish state became something more like a moral imperative, or something for which, by which Europe could assuage its conscience for what it did to us Jews. So I think it's very, very important. I suppose it's very important to emphasize that these people thought of themselves no less Zionists.
Yeah.
They actually considered themselves Zionists.
Definitely.
And their position was, as I understand it, to recognize the historical link, the strong historical bonds between Jews and the Holy Land. Going back to your thing, what you said early on about in the prayers and everything, is next year in Jerusalem. It's not that they repudiated a Jewish bond. What they repudiated was an exclusive Jewish purchase on a part of this territory.
So let me get it clear that you probably would have been a cultural Zionist had you lived in that time with your political mind and your political persuasion of today. You probably have been a cultural Zionist at the time.
Yeah. We have spoken about this before, and it's given me pause for some thoughts and reflection. Given my background, and I suppose it's important, my background is I was brought up in a very Orthodox Jewish Zionist family, but given the dissident positions, if you look at my biography, the dissident positions in terms of anti-apartheid, turning to question the whole Zionist project, as much as we can sort of try and look back retrospectively, I probably would have been one of those dissidents who and probably would have been a member of Brit Shalom and.
Okay, so that's a good position. So let's just look at that First World War, Second World War. Will you agree with me that the great grievance of the current Palestinians or people that should be the people living there? Should be for the British and French carving and saying, here's a land to the Jews. The Jews had been saying, Shana Haba'ah Berushalayim. They were always saying, we'll go back if we've given the chance. But who gave them the chance other than the French and the British? And let me say this, that if there's a grievance, that was the Nakba, the Sykes-Picot agreement, the Sykes-Picot agreement. That was the Nakba. That is the tragedy. To say that the tragedy was that they didn't wipe out the Jewish state in 1948 in an existential war, no, I don't see that as a tragedy. I can relate to them having that Arab peninsula without a Jewish state there, and then And then somebody says, oh, you know what, we've just won the war and we're going down anyway as an empire, and the French are pretty much going down as well, so why don't we just carve this area up for ourselves? The imperial forces you're talking about, but don't blame it on Jews. Jews always wanted to go back. Now they had to grab this opportunity given to them by the French and the British.
Well, I'll put it this way. I partially agree that may well be a part of the Nakba, but as I said, there's a logical continuity. So what the Palestinians claim is the Nakba. In other words, the Nakba turned out to be an expulsion of some 700,000 local inhabitants. But I agree that they can't be divorced from one another. But that doesn't make the charge against the contemporary Zionist project one of complicit.
But just starting with that point.
But yeah, I certainly agree. As an anti-imperialist, absolutely, they had no...
It wasn't Jews who gave the Jews the chance to come back. Jews had said, we want to come back all this time. And then the French and the British meet in secret in 1916, and they basically carve up the map. And I can understand an Arab not liking that, but as a Jew that might have been saying next year in Jerusalem, I wanted it.
But surely you understand that once the partition plan had been declared in 1947, and Ben-Gurion then
declared a state.
Declared a state, and it's also questionable whether the UN actually sanctioned the declaring of a Jewish state, but they basically presented them with a fait accompli. It certainly was going in that direction. But surely you can agree that irrespective of whether the surrounding Arab countries, and certainly I would accept certainly many of the Palestinians didn't want a Jewish state and were hoping that the Arab armies would make this would put an end to it. But it nevertheless remains a terrible what they call a Nakba to leave. I mean, the accounts, the stories of Israelis going into Palestinian homes, the coffee's still burning, the cooker's still on. That is a great tragedy in itself, and I think the tragedy is which sort of kind of in my understanding and having thought about it a lot, is that even though you have been defeated, even though your intention was defeated, the intention being the prevention of this Jewish state coming to fruition, it's still pretty cruel to say, the price you pay for the defeat is you can never return to your home. You're a refugee.
Yeah, I do see
especially
that.
Given that not all of them, did not want a Jewish state or whatever. Sorry, let me put it this way. Never mind not want a Jewish state. Many of them did not want to leave they were driven out by Israeli forces.
But understand
they
one
could have
thing,
stayed.
of course they would.
The majority would have stayed, and the fact that this new Israeli state would not permit them to return, in a way calls the Israeli state's bluff, because they say, well, we accepted the partition plan, but they didn't.
So let me just get clear, because we are talking about what was the great Nakba or tragedy or unfortunate thing that happened to the Arabs who later would become the Palestinians. I'm suggesting that when the head of Mosul is not someone that you would think that I would quote and understand what he's saying, because just about everything else he did I think was absolutely horrific and abhorrent. But he did give a speech sometime in the 2010s in the great mosque of Mosul, where he said, we, ISIS, will not desist until we have knocked the last nail into the coffin of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Now, one thing I do agree with the head of ISIS in saying that is that really is the cause of the issue. In other words, what I'm saying is that once the French and British in a secret agreement, which then progressed further the next year, 1916, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, 1917, the Balfour Declaration, once that process was in order, that was always a wound into this area which was designated Arabia. There was no Iraq, Syria, there wasn't Iraq, there wasn't Jordan, there wasn't, these are new, it changed. That of the old empire, the British Empire going down in conjunction with the French collaboration, are saying, yeah, we're going to divide this up into countries and we're going to give us Jewish state. And then later on they created Jordan, which took away a lot of the land that could have been shared between the Jews and the later Palestinians. And that, to me, was the Nakba. That is the horror show, not the loss that the loss of the civil war in Israel after a state after United Nations resolution for a state in Israel, and after David Ben-Gurion declared a state, there was a civil war in Israel. That's when all the expulsions or the loss of land or the Palestinians leaving, whatever you want to call it, that's when that happened. And then that was followed by a proper existential war with other Arab countries trying to defeat, completely destroy the new Zionist state. And I just want to say one more thing, because I'm saying you want to blame somebody for what's going on. Blame that you're not an imperialist, I'm pretty sure. Blame the imperial powers of the British. Blame the French. Don't blame the Jews or the Zionists, because they always wanted to come back. They would come back under the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. They would have come back under anybody who would have said, yes, you can come back. And pretty much under any borders, very small borders in 1936, the Peel Commission. And what I want to just say one last thing about British collusion, collusion in this. I have been brought up on unbelievable British values in South Africa as an English-speaking South African. I went to a school, the Selborne College, started by the Earl of Selborne. It was a military school. You could learn to fire a gun at my school. There was a shooting range at my school, okay? So I know what, and my father, cadets. My father went to the same school. He volunteered to journey thousands of miles into Europe to fight in the Second World War. What did the British do in South Africa? What did they do after they'd dealt with the gold and the diamonds? They allowed South Africa to petition for a republic through a referendum. So the British sanctioned a referendum in South Africa in 1955, which said you can vote. Do you want to become a Republic of South Africa, or do you want to remain part of the Commonwealth? And that will be the referendum. Just one problem. Let me just finish this one point. That's just one problem. Only whites voted. And then I must just brought up one other thing, one other casualty of the decline of the British Empire, which was India, 1948. What happened there with the division of Pakistan, the million that died, the 10 million that were displaced, the horror show that happened there. These were the acts of a desperate empire that was going down, and it did these things. But what I'm saying is, you want to blame anyone, blame the French and the Jews for carving up the Middle East and saying there's going to be a Jewish state. Do not blame the Zionists who always wanted to go back.
I hear you, and I'm in partial agreement with what you say, because of course a large share of the responsibility for the mess that is in the Middle East rests on the shoulders of the great imperial powers of Europe, France and Great Britain in particular. So as an anti-imperialist, I completely agree with you. But where I disagree with you, you try and split off this, what I see as a logical continuity, and therefore the Zionist complicity in the expulsion of the indigenous Palestinian population. Yes, it may well be, it very well is the fault of Britain and France, but I don't think you can absolve, I don't think the Zionists can absolve themselves of some responsibility, especially since the actual existential experience. So you can say the consequences, the Nakba began with the Sykes-Picot Act.
Thank you.
But it didn't finish there.
Yeah.
It finished with the forcible removal of hundreds of thousands of indigenous Palestinians in the war that ensued. And so I see a logical a continuity. I don't think that the Zionists, and I don't want to conflate Jews with Zionists, because there are plenty Jews who were opposed to the Zionists and continue to be opposed. So I would say the complicity is not a one of Jews, but of Zionists. I also want to come to the question of India and Pakistan, which is also a great tragedy. But, and it's a very big but, without diminishing the tragedy. Of course, I would have preferred to see this large Indian subcontinent.
Sure.
Then they would probably be our enemies, like China, our great adversaries that probably would have developed in leaps and bounds. But, and the big but is, these peoples achieved their own state. They got whatever the ills were in terms of the intercommunal strife, and I'm not sure whether there was an equivalence of simply expelling people, but people did. People did go, but the Muslims got their Pakistan, and the Indians, of course, got got India. That's the big difference. So without, as I'm saying, without diminishing the wrongs and the injustice done to certain groups of people, the fact of the matter is there are two states. The weeping wounds of the Middle East and the Israel-Palestinian conflict is that the Palestinians still don't have a state. So my anti-Zionism or lapsed Zionism is, there's now the big debates. I mean, most of my people, left-wing circles that I move in, say that the two-state solution's dead. Even many Zionists are saying now, conveniently, that the two-state solution's dead. So I'm thinking two states, one state. This is something that's got to be sorted out between the two peoples. So I, as a Jew, have nothing to say on the matter, because I do not consider myself a Zionist. I don't have, I mean, I do have some family who live there, and I've been to the place, and I've liked the place. But I recognise that this is not my homeland, in contradistinction to Louis Brandeis.
And me.
And
But
this is my this is my homeland, and for many Jews, anti-Zionist Jews, this is their homeland as well. Now the problem comes for the anti-Zionist non-Jews.
We'll come on to that, anti-Zionism. Next conversation.
Which is, I'm sort of, what's the word, perplexed and intrigued, because I'm thinking, what on earth do they make of this? You have, obviously, actually, I was going to say, obviously, probably the majority of Jews do feel some kind of affinity with Israel and are Zionists. But the fact of the matter is, I think the majority population of Zionists are the evangelical Christians
we'll come on to this.
in the United States.
But let's just talk about you as a Zionist. I think what you've admitted, actually, in this talk, just to sum up in a way, I think you've admitted that you would have been a cultural Zionist like Ahad Ha'am. In other words, you understand that Jews have an association with that place and a desire to live in that place. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you are a cultural Zionist. You would have been a cultural Zionist then. You might not have gone with Herzl. You certainly wouldn't have gone with Vladimir Jabotinsky in revisionist Zionists. You certainly wouldn't go with a theocratic Zionist. I wouldn't go with a theocratic Zionist, the religious Zionists either. But I would have been a straight down the line political Zionist in the line of Theodor Herzl, and you may not have. So you may still think, at that time, had you been alive, I would have been with Ahad Ha'am and those people, Martin Buber. Who was the other one? Magnus, you said?
Judah Magnus,
yeah. You would have been
organizations.
But that means that you would have been involved in this idea of Jews returning. They're not necessarily being in control of everything, but the idea of Jews being able to go and live and to associate with Israel as a place. Because that was the cultural Zionist position.
I mean, it's hard to speculate, because of course there were and are some Jews brought up in Israel, tzabras, who have become total dissidents, who have completely repudiated Zionism. And I've read. I'm not, but I'm not saying they're the majority, but I've read and I follow them. I follow Gideon Levy, who writes for Haaretz, who was an advisor to Shimon Peres, who was a Zionist well into adulthood, and he's come to the conclusion that the only solution is one secular democratic state. So given my tendency to join the dissidents, or to join the dissidents, because I've always been on the side of those who I consider oppressed and suffering injustice. I may well have been a refusenik, given that I am a deserter from the apartheid army of
deserter. This man,
Africa.
Let me say something about this man. He's not just a deserter of the South African army, which he did serve, a year, whatever. He is mentioned in a couple of books by ANC activists who actually risked their lives by going back to South Africa. And in 2 books that I've read of those, you are mentioned as a safe pair of hands, that they could speak to you or trust you, that you were a safe pair of hands to talk to. So, in this, we both were deeply against apartheid. But you, I will say it straight away, I was outspoken against it, you were outspoken, but you took risks. You actually sacrificed much bigger than I did in that respect. So I have deep respect for that. There's no question about that.
Thank you. I took modest risks. I wouldn't like to
but risks, nevertheless. So let us think, this is what we've discussed Zionism, we've discussed what we agree. You more would have been a cultural Zionist, I would have always been a political Zionist. Neither of us supports theocratic or religious Zionism. When it comes to revisionist Zionism, that's something we can look at again, the Jabotinsky Zionism, and many types of Zionism. The mainstream was Herzl's political Zionism. So now in the next talk that we will return to this to talk about what does anti-Zionism mean. But what I'm thinking, you're going to say anti-political Zionism, not anti the Zionism of Ahad Ha'am and people like that. You're going to talk about anti-political Zionism.
Yeah, I'm going to. You see, the thing is, there's a great mythology about Zionism, and all ideologies are based on a mythology which presents its case as coherent, without contradictions. And it's, as I was growing up, it was a very attractive set of ideas.
Romantic ideas.
A very romantic. But as I subjected it to closer personal scrutiny, based on my own experiences, having been on Ulpan to Israel with my school, where you learn Hebrew. And I went just after not long after the 6-day war. So I've been to all these territories that they speak of: Gaza, Khan Yunis, Rafah, almost up to the Suez Canal. I've seen all of that. And then I went as a volunteer at the end of my first year of university after the Yom Kippur War, and that's when I began to question the whole Zionist project. So I don't repudiate the Jewish connection with the Holy Land as a cultural project, but I'm more interested in the injustice that the indigenous Palestinian population suffers. And then I hark back to people like Ahad Ha'am. I mean, what date are we speaking about? Ahad Ha'am is the early 19th century. Even then, they were, even then, people like Ahad Ha'am and people who followed his position were pointing out, not only warning, but saying that the Jewish settlers were treating the local Palestinian peasants terribly.
Well, they wouldn't have called themselves Palestinians, but the people living there, the Arabs living there.
And they warned. They said, how can you treat people like that? It sort of has resonances of my growing revulsion of apartheid. How you can treat people, and even then they were warning. These people are human beings with feelings just like our own, with aspirations like our own, and they eventually won't accept it. Yeah. And their warnings were very, very prescient. They said, I mean, you cited Zev Jabotinsky and the father of Irgun and the Stern Gang, the revisionists, and Likud Netanyahu, and they were they in a way were the confirmation of what people like Ahad Ha'am, the cultural Zionists, were warning. They basically said, we're always going to have to fight here. There are people living here, and we need to treat them with the mailed fist. And the cultural Zionists were basically saying, you are going to have to exist as a garrison state for the rest of this state's life. And it's very, very prescient in terms of what's happening.
I hear you. And what is strong about what you're saying is this was an intra-Jewish argument. It wasn't involving other people. It was Jews arguing with each other, and there are many books have been written on this. So now we have set the tone of what we understand about Zionism. I think we have. So we will move on in the next talk to talk about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and how these can be conflated in various ways and how they can be distinguished. So we'll move on. Anyway, it's been good to talk to you. I have refined my own thoughts a little bit from this talk, which is our goal. So thank you. We'll move on to that, to anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and then we'll move on to what's really going on now, not only based on history, but what, given the situation now, and what possibly could be done about it.